In the wake of President Obama's call for European unity, can the Europeans actually become united? Again, as we speak, we are awaiting in the United Kingdom a referendum which could even mean the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. And there are all kinds of debate within the United Kingdom about the merits of being within Europe and the merits of leaving Europe. The idea of having a foreign policy that is suited for the United Kingdom by itself, not being tied up with European foreign policy, that is something which is very attractive to many political figures, particularly on the conservative wing of United Kingdom politics. There's a special antipathy, a special opposition to what is called the common foreign and security policy of Europe. This is meant to harmonize the different foreign policies of all the different member states of the EU into something that is coherent. Now, in fact, this never really worked. It can never really bring together all of the different state interests of all the members of Europe, and yet the ideal behind it, that Europe should speak with one voice, is something which is very, very strong, particularly on the part of those who believe in a future for the European Union. But then the question arises, if Europe were to develop an actual, coherent and forceful common foreign and security policy, how would it enforce that policy? Should Europe, as a diplomatic entity, also have the same rights as a state to project its interests by its own power to fulfill its own policy requirements? And of course it can't. This is why what you have in international organization is the existence of the European Union side by side with NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was established in 1949. And certainly as far as the United States is concerned, the two go together. They are separate organizations, but to all intents and purposes, the US would see the NATO as the militarized side of an alliance which on the civilian side depends on a unified Europe. Of course, having a unified military wing is something which is very threatening to those states that are not members of Europe, who are not part of NATO. And nowhere is this insecurity more felt than on the part of Russia, the old Soviet Union. That old great antagonist to the United States, to Western Europe, that was meant to have been defeated by the fall of communism in 1989, but which seems now, underneath President Putin, to be raising its sense of being strong again, and certainly its sense of being able to assert itself strongly in international diplomacy and in the international projection of its military force. This being seen partly in Europe with the annexation of the Crimea from Ukraine, seen also outside of Europe with the projection of military force in Syria to change the balance of military power in that country in the terrible war that is now besetting Syria, and in terms of the Russian military machine setting an example of what it can do if called upon, which might be of a threat to Europe itself in the future. Now, in fact, there's probably very little chance of a military confrontation in actuality between the newly reborn Russia and Western Europe. In fact, in terms of rhetoric, it's been President Putin who has made all of the running, particularly in a speech in 2007, saying that the West, the United States in particular, but Europe also as an ally of the United States, as depending far too much on the projection of military power. It talks power, it talks force, well before it wishes to talk in any other sense of diplomatic activity and in terms of diplomatic subtlety and nicety. This was a considerable challenge on the part of the Russian president, particularly as he's shown he's not averse to projecting military power himself before the use of diplomatic instruments in recent conflicts such as in Crimea, such as in Syria. But this reassertion of Russian capacity, military as well as a renewed interest in all aspects of international relations, means that for the Western Europe of today, there is a new era that is beginning. How to develop a diplomatic policy, a diplomatic practice that is able, on the part of the individual European states and on the part of the unified European Union, how this set of policies can confront, address, and come to terms with the renaissance of Russian power, the renaissance of Russian policy. Whether or not this is all a blip, whether or not this is something that will last only as long as the Russian economy continues to be stable, whether it's something that cannot outlive President Putin, all of these are imponderable questions. But it does mean that as we speak, the configuration of power, and therefore the configuration of diplomatic maneuvers, and therefore the formulation of foreign policy is changing underneath our feet as we confront a new Europe that may not be divided in strict terms between East and West anymore, but which is certainly, in terms of the possibilities of a confrontation, beginning to assume the dimensions of a kind of East-West standoff, even if it never becomes as cold as the Cold War once was. In terms of how this will affect the rest of the world, well, there's been Russian outreach to many other parts of the world. It's that part of Europe that is trying also to compete with Western Europe. Russia has been very, very busy making diplomatic and economic deals with India, with China. It has been reaching out to the Middle East. It's been a supporter not only of the government in Syria, it's made overtures to Iran, so that the United States' new posture and new policy of coming to peaceful terms with Iran has been matched from the very beginning by a Russian outreach to Iran, so that the competition between the United States and Russia for influence in other parts of the world, the Middle East, India, China, these are images writ large as the Americans try to establish, on the one hand, their transatlantic trade and investment partnership and their trans-Pacific partnership. This whole sense of trying to unify the world into trading blocs, into preferential access blocs, has been checked either by the Russians on the one hand, or, as we shall discover next week, being checked by similar blocs being formed by the Chinese. A new arrival on the scene of international diplomacy that is making the formulation of foreign policy into something which is truly hazardous.